Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, Distinguished Law Professor at Rutgers Law School and Director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. You can learn more about the center by visiting our website at csrr.rutgers.edu or following us on Instagram at RutgersCSRR or on Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook at RUCSRR. The Race and Rights Podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, here as well as abroad. Today's podcast is entitled Islam in Liberalism, featuring Columbia University professor Joseph Massad. In this episode, Professor Massad discusses American anxieties about intolerance, misogyny, and tyranny that are projected onto Islam as part of the broader European use of Islam as a foil in Western liberalism. Professor Massad contextualizes this trend within recent efforts by the Western world to proselytize liberalism as the only valid and sane worldview to Muslim-majority nations, and references a rich historical record of Christian and liberal discourses that reveal such attempts to cure Muslims of their supposed illiberal ways. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic that impacts how Muslims are treated in the United States and Europe today.
Thank you very much for coming this afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. I've never been here before, so this is an important event. I'm going to speak sort of about the general argument of what the book is about. The book is kind of it's a relatively large book with 5 chapters, and it has basically its main argument has to do with how Western liberalism and liberal regimes since the 18th century until the present have dealt with something or engaged with something that they termed Islam. And the main argument of the book is that Islam figures in a history of liberalism, both as political regimes and as political thought, since its inception. Indeed, Islam figures in the history of the making of Europe itself in very foundational ways. So even if we look at different points in history that are sometimes sort of advanced as the birth date of Europe, say Charlemagne. Charlemagne, of course, would not have been possible, as many European historians would say, had it not been for Muslim expansion and occupation of Spain and parts of Europe. If you look at the Crusades as another sort of moment of Christendom sort of coming into its own sort of new identity, Islam also figures prominently. If you look at the Reconquista in 1492, also Islam sort of figures very much in all of these dates, right? So in large measure, we see also how liberalism, and from the 17th century on, and after sort of the beginning of the ideas of liberalism, would engage with something called Islam as an other, sort of very, very early. We see this, but also, of course, the question of Christianity would be very much formative for liberal thought. And part of what I'm trying to do in the book is, at least in the first book on the question of democracy and despotism, is to look at how systems of government and systems of governance more generally came to be associated with things that we call, or have been calling for the last 2 centuries, religion, and sometimes culture. How would this sort of be mapped onto one another? And of course, a big part of this is that Christianity, or at least Protestant Christianity, seems to have been seen and theorized in many ways as foundational to what becomes liberalism, whether from John Locke's argument about the reasonableness of Christianity, or subsequently to people like Montesquieu, who would advance the notion of what he called Oriental despotism in the 18th century. And we'll see this also in arguments that would be advanced early on by thinkers who want to advance women's rights, women's freedoms from the late 18th century onwards. And the second chapter, the longest chapter of the book, in fact, deals with the question of women in Islam. The third chapter deals with questions of sexuality and how sexuality is constructed in relation to sexual rights discourse, especially in the past 50 years. The fourth chapter deals with ongoing debates and psychoanalysis, especially in Europe, and how the question of Islam figures psychologically in the psyche of Europeans and Muslims. The book ends with the question of the Semites and the Aryans, and so it goes back to the discourse on Semitism from the 18th century, philology, then the discourse of anti-Semitism from the late 19th century, and how they come together sort of in several questions, principally in the question of Palestine, which becomes also a key sort of opening debates on the question of Islam and Muslims. Now, going back to the question of democracy, I'll spend some time on the question of sort of despotism and democracy, because of course liberalism as a system of thought and as regimes focuses on specifically this question, and of course it was very generative of a large number of debates, one of which of course begins in the 18th century on the nature of despotism in Europe. And much of what we see in that debate, beginning with Montesquieu, is the problem with how European despots seem to be too oriental. So in many ways, the Oriental despotism emerges sort of, and in many ways, I would say, prefigures what becomes the Eastern question in the late 18th century, which is the question of the Ottoman Empire for Europe. And many of the complaints about absolutism in Europe is that these despots, these European despots of the French king, seem to treat their subjects the way allegedly Muslim despots or Oriental despots treat their subjects. So the problem with Europe is that it was too Oriental. But that the project of the Enlightenment and the project of liberalism was to occidentalize it, to make it more Western. We will see this also in the discourse on women and their liberation. People like Mary Wollstonecraft, and I'll discuss her a bit further, would speak about how Christian European men are treating Christian European women the way Muslim men treat their women. So again, the problem with the behavior or with the discrimination against women or the denial of freedom or equality is that it was too Oriental and Muslim. So the project was actually that Europe seemed too Oriental and Muslim, and the project was to make it less so, to occidentalize it, to make it Western in ways that no longer resemble what the discourse of liberalism seemed to be suggesting at that time. And of course, it's within that rubric that you begin to see, of course, the importance of the myth of Greek origins of European liberalism and European culture. This becomes also a philological argument. Words like democracy and despotism, of course, have Greek origins, words even like citizenship, civility, all of these things seem to have important Greek precursors, and of course Roman and Latin precursors. So the idea of Roman republicanism and Greek democracy would become important. Yet the important bit of linking the Greeks and the Roman republicanism to modern liberal thought and modern liberal and democratic regimes still sort of ends up being Protestant Christianity, and how important that is to the development of democratic thought and democratic liberalism. And it's this link of Christianity to democracy that also links Islam to anti-democracy and to despotism. So suddenly religion seems to be a precursor to, prefigures systems of government, as well as sort of philosophies of democracy and philosophies of government, both as regime and as a system of thought. So we begin to see also the linkage of religion to economic systems, right? The famous, of course, linkage of Protestantism to capitalism would come in. And here, of course, the problem of Islam as not being necessarily capitalist, possibly feudal, but certainly neither democratic in terms of governance and neither capitalistic in terms of economy, which would become the basis to account for failures, quote unquote, of countries, of Muslim majority countries, in either economic development or in approximating liberal democracies the way Christian European countries seem to have done. Of course, here the French and the American revolutions would be most important in the development of this discourse. And what's interesting, of course, is that even theorists of American democracy, de Tocqueville, for example, is very interested in claiming that even though religion, Christianity or different Christian sects play an important role in American life, they are delinked from governance in certain ways that allow for what he calls democracy in America, unlike he gives us the example of the Turks, where religion and Islam seem to be not in any way separated from the system of governance, hence the failure of the Ottomans and the Turks to provide a democratic system. Here, of course, all of this was happening with the development of a new discourse Massad just alluded to the question of Orientalism that Edward Said had studied. This becomes important, of course, in the 18th century, alongside the development of liberal thought, and both, of course, developed in the context of the expansion of European empires and colonialism. These were not sort of ideas that preceded the modern onset of European colonialism, but rather were sort of either juxtaposed to it or, as some would argue, very much part and parcel of it. Kudai Mehta, in his important book on liberalism and empire, would connect a lot of the liberal thinkers to colonial endeavors and to support of colonialism. In fact, liberalism and colonialism went hand in hand rather than being opposition. Indeed, some of the more conservative thinkers, people like Edmund Burke, would have a very different view of Islam as much more democratic, say, than European absolutism. But he would be sort of a lone voice in that roster of thinkers at that time. But the development of Orientalism would be very important because here Islam would not only be a religion in this Western new sort of secular understanding of what a religion is, but also a culture or a civilization. So there's not only a system of faith, but also it's culturalized and in many ways referred to as a civilization. And in doing so, we will see how questions of culture will become endemic to debates on democracy, debates on women's rights and sexuality as we get to the 19th and the 20th century. And so, in that sense, it's not only a question of faith, but also a question of a cultural system that defines or prefigures a lot of what happens. We begin to see, for example, the opposite does not happen. There are no culturalist arguments or advanced as why, for example, the U.S. system was so undemocratic. Why would the U.S. Republic have the first century, a century of slavery, and the second century, a century of apartheid? It's never culturalized. We're never told that this is part of the culture of white property-owning Protestant men that actually generates the need for enslaving people or to segregate them racially. We are not told that it is Protestant culture that denies women the vote, for example, or suffrage more generally. So there's no culturalization of the failures of European systems, right? Even European absolutism, we're never told that the culture of Europe produced the kinds of kings and absolutism, let alone explain the colonial endeavors and the kinds of genocidal policies that Europe undertook. None of this is culturalized. So the cultural explanations and the religious explanations, when deployed in Europe, they're deployed in Europe only for the production of a good that is sort of normatively considered desirable, such as democracy and liberal thought. And in the case of Muslim majority countries, it is always deployed to explain and explicate failures of achieving these normatively highly valued goods, right? So we see in this context, of course, we see the development also within Middle East studies. In the US, Orientalism, of course, would not be as important discipline as it was in Europe, since it had, in fact, emerged in Europe since the late 18th century as part and parcel of the colonial endeavor. By the time it gets to the US, while many of the stereotypes and many of the academic givens are adopted by American scholars on the Middle East, with the sudden sort of emergence after World War II of area studies and Middle East studies, we would see Orientalism become more institutionalized in or under the rubric of Middle East studies, which is mostly the social sciences, but also the humanities. And it is there where you get to see all these explanations, cultural explanations for the so-called non-democracy or undemocracy of Muslim majority countries or Arab countries, and the explanations for which have always been found in Islam as religion or Arabness as culture or a combination therein. What is interesting historically, especially in the 19th century to the 20th century, is how liberal regimes have been interested in transforming or capturing something they call Islam and how they relate it to questions of governance and government. So one of the projects that begins in the 1870s by the British, but also the French and the Dutch. Remember, by the 1870s, the British control a large Muslim population, especially in India. The French have a huge also Muslim population in Algeria and expanding in North Africa and elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And the Dutch, of course, in Indonesia also have a large Muslim population. This becomes of major concern, especially as relates to what becomes the de rigueur question of the period, the question of the caliphate. And indeed, the question of the caliphate long before ISIS would be a British question, and what to do with Muslim caliphs. There was an early attempt at involving the Ottoman Sultan, who didn't also have the title of caliph, early on in the 19th century in the context of Napoleon's attempt to woo the Indian Muslim population against British colonialism. Immediately the British would approach the Ottoman Sultanate to speak to Muslim subjects in India, to urge them not to revolt against the British. This would become a very important call and a very important function from the Ottoman Caliph actually during the UK in 1857. When the British insisted that the Caliph issue a directive to Indian Muslims not to revolt against Britain. Now, as a result of this, the concern in the 1870s would arise, and what if the Caliph were to actually tell Muslims to revolt against all three Christian empires, whether the Dutch, the French, or the British? This became such a huge concern in the 1870s and 1880s that the British undertook a whole project of completely removing the caliphate from the Turks and to give it to the Arabs. And in order to do this, you see a huge amount of production, cultural but also religious production, by Orientalist British scholars who began to unearth all kinds of sayings of the Prophet to prove that the Caliph must be an Arab and cannot be a Turk, based on Sharia, both based on a religious reason. And they began, of course, to have talks with members of the Hashemite family who ruled the Hijaz at that time in order to have them replace the Turkish Caliph. And also at the same time beginning to put forth a new understanding of what the Caliphate should be, namely that it should be like the papacy, a spiritual type of leadership, a religious leadership that has nothing to do with politics. This would generate a large number of books by European Orientalists, but increasingly by Muslim scholars, especially by the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century, arguing that in fact Islam, whatever that is, it's unclear what the term Islam of course means in these debates, whether it means the Quran, it means the Hadith, it means systems of thought, it means culture. This confusion about the meaning and the multiplicity of the references of something called Islam becomes very productive in these kinds of debates. So you see major Arab thinkers in the early 20th century writing precisely about how the caliphate should not have anything to do with politics, that it should only be a spiritual matter. A division, of course, which is a Christian division, and a new Christian division at that does not exist in Muslim theology, like the idea of the material and the spiritual, because just like Judaism, just like other forms of Christianity, Islam does not only concern itself with some worship for an hour on Sunday morning, right? And therefore it is a very different understanding of the spiritual and the material and their interactions. Nonetheless, we see people like Muhammad Abdu al-Afghani, even a very important Syrian thinker, al-Kawakibi, who would live in Egypt, who would begin to produce and actually replicate works already published in English or French or Italian, claiming that this is actually their own Arab Muslim scholarship to prove that Islam has no business being part of governance, that in fact it has a secular approach ultimately to rule, or it leaves material and worldly governance to politicians and will not engage in it. The second transformation, or the second project that liberal regimes were interested in would come about from the 1950s. Initially, actually, it would be a totalitarian regime that would be interested in mobilizing now what they come to call jihadism in Islam. It would be the Nazis who would be very, very interested in subverting the Soviet Union under Stalin by trying to mobilize Soviet Muslims precisely against communism as a godless, heretical ideology, and therefore attempt to break the Soviet Union from within. Well, that didn't work for the Nazis. The Americans, of course, would immediately bring in all the Nazi experts on the Soviet Muslims after the war. And when Eisenhower came to power in the early 1950s, especially in 1953, there was a memorandum sent to him as to what is the best policy for the US and the Middle East. The memorandum was called The Religious Factor. And Eisenhower would begin to speak very openly about the importance of mobilizing mobilizing jihad against communism in the Middle East. This would be sort of the beginning of the Cold War, and the mobilization of jihadism would begin to be undertaken by a liberal regime like the US for precisely this purpose. It would be deployed, of course, against the Soviet regime by attempting to infiltrate Soviet Muslims at the annual pilgrimage in Mecca. It would be used against the nationalist rule of Sukarno in Indonesia, where several fundamentalist Muslim republics would declare themselves against Sukarno's nationalist rule in the 50s. They would subsequently be defeated. But again, the US would use them in 1965, especially with the major anti-Sukarno coup, the result of which would be almost the murder of anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million Indonesians under the rubric that they were communists. The CIA, some of you may know the history of Indonesia, would actually provide names and addresses to the militias in Indonesia to continue the killing. The American embassy was heavily involved in that. But in fact, those jihadists that began in the 1950s in Indonesia are mobilized even further in the mid-60s. It was from amongst them that the jihadists that would go to Afghanistan and join bin Laden would come in the late 70s with the Mujahideen, and then by the 80s and 90s would join sort of the bin Laden effort. In that sense, also, the Saudis would become, of course, very important in mobilizing this kind of jihadism, and this, in the case of the Arab world, precisely against left-wing Arab nationalism. So Nasser, especially, would have to confront this question, whether from the Muslim Brotherhood initially that were, at the time, unlike today, pro-Saudi and funded by the Saudis and supported by them, but also in different contexts around not only the Arab world, but increasingly with the formation of the Muslim League around the Muslim world more generally, precisely for as part of the U.S. effort to defeat third world nationalist groups that were seen and perceived. Subsequently, CIA reports would say wrongly so, as inimical to U.S. interests. Indeed, some CIA later reports would say this was a large or a huge mistake that the U.S. had committed from the 50s through the early 70s of considering nationalist forces as anti-U.S. and that, of course, poisoned their relations with them by supporting jihadist efforts. Since the sort of 80s and 90s, but in a larger effort after 2001, we see the new project. Now, the new project is almost going back to the earlier British project. Now it's an American project of liberalizing Islam and supporting a democratic Islam. But this project is kind of ambivalent. It still goes hand in hand with the support for some forms of jihadism. For example, in a place like Syria, different kinds of jihadist groups would be supported against a regime that is seen as secular, whereas in places, and in other places, there would be sort of moderate, what the US would call moderate Islamist forces that would be supported for electoral kinds of politics. But at the same time, there's the whole issue of liberal democratic NGOs that would be dispatched across Muslim majority countries, but especially the Arab world, for the specific purpose of creating what they call civil society. The question of civil society, of course, goes back to the 18th and 19th century and to Weber. Weber would be very interested in saying how democratic regimes must have a civil society, and part of the problem of Muslim countries and Muslim culture is that they lack a civil society. And so you would see sort of that the whole idea of a civil society would become very important in the mobilization by NGOs sort of to missionize democracy, perhaps, as the highest stage of Protestant Christianity in this discourse. Let me just move very briefly. How are you doing on time?
7 minutes.
Okay, so let me speak just a little about the second chapter, which deals also with similar Christian missions, this time not to rescue all Muslims from Muslim despots, but also to rescue specifically Muslim women from Muslim men. This becomes a very important endeavor even from the late 19th century, and like the discourse on democracy, the discourse on rescuing and saving women from oppression is also a Christian discourse. It begins by white women Christian missionaries in the 19th century, initially to civilize and help Native American women, but also they would begin to be dispatched to Muslim countries to missionize Protestant Christianity, sometimes Catholic from Europe, but mostly Protestant Christians. Places like Egypt would become major targets of these kinds of missions. And like I said, sort of, the idea that Muslims treat women like slaves goes back to Mary Wollstonecraft versus sort of the new idea that Western women are the luckiest in the world. As many feminists, of course, have shown, this discourse has always served to downgrade the demands by Western women for equality by telling them, well, look, you live so much better than Muslim women. And of course, much of the depiction of how Muslim women live is very much fictional, given the fact that, of course, there are all kinds of what today we call rights that Muslim women had always had: right to property, right to divorce, right to custody of children, that Western women did not acquire till very, very late, and in some cases have not even acquired today. Yet, of course, the idea that Muslim women were treated as slaves or were in fact legally considered slaves would be predominant in Western Christian feminist circles. We also see sort of during colonial times, in the case of Egypt, Lord Cromer, who was the absolute British ruler of Egypt, a man who, for example, opposed suffrage for women in Britain, yet suddenly became a feminist in the case of Egypt, insisting on questions of that women should not wear the hijab in Egypt, and supporting women's rights. So sort of sexist at home, feminist in the colonies is a very interesting contrast in the case of someone like Cromer. We find that perhaps not, it's not very strange, and not only late 19th, early 20th century situation. President Bush, as you know, was not really a friend of the women's movement, yet in Afghanistan he seemed to want to liberate Muslim women from their Muslim male captors. So this is an ongoing discourse, not only a historical one. The question of the hijab, of course, only became a question for Westerners. It was never a question in Muslim majority countries, and that became a big debate as a result of the colonial interest in the question of hijab. One of the interesting things that happens in this discourse is precisely that the Eastern question that begins in the late 18th century was not only the question of despotism, but also it becomes the woman's question. And in that sense, if we look at the opposite of the Eastern question, namely the Western question, also it becomes the woman's question, in the sense the Western fantasy and fiction that women in the West actually don't suffer from inequality, don't suffer from sexism, but live as equal citizens, whereas outside in the East they seem to. And here we begin to see the beginning also of the culturalization of what we call today sexism. That indeed many of the crimes that are now identified as gender crimes committed outside the US, especially in Muslim majority countries, becomes sort of Muslim gender crimes. Specifically, they're culturalized and depicted as a result of culture and religion, whereas crimes against women in the US and the West become individual. So, for example, the fact that upwards from 35 to 45% of women who are murdered in the US are murdered by their husbands or lovers or ex-husbands or ex-lovers is seen as sort of an individual crime. It is not subject to the category anymore of passion crimes. There's no special UN commissions or special television programs telling us about the misogyny of American culture, that this is a horrible sort of murder that needs a special attention. Yet the lower percentage, say, of so-called honor crimes, the highest percentage of which happens in Jordan, which is 25% of women who are murdered by family members, usually brothers or fathers. And yet that, of course, there are UN commissions, special television programs. Of course, both crimes are gender crimes, yet one is cultural, seen as cultural, one is seen as a result of Arabs and Muslims. The other one seems to be just an aberration, but it is not definitional of the culture of the US as a sexist, misogynistic, or violent culture toward women, but rather reflects only on the individuals who commit these crimes. So the culturalization of gender crimes, of course, it's not only in Muslim countries, it happens when it deals also with Latinos, with Indian Hindus. The question of dowry deaths, just like honor crimes, become a special sort of oriental gender crime that the US does not suffer from in many ways. A big debate sort of from the 90s on, especially by conservative feminist Susan Oken, who advanced the idea that the problem, that we must sort of rescue women who have become victims of culture, such as Muslim women who will have, we should destroy the culture, just take the women out and help them out. dialogue. In many ways, of course, there have been responses to this by Muslim feminists, especially on the question of the sartorial limitations or restrictions on women. And I just thought I would read something very, very quickly from what Leila Ahmed had to say about this issue in response to these kinds of arguments, just to show you the irony of it. So Ahmed notes in response to these arguments that it was never argued, for instance, even by the most ardent 19th century feminists, that European women could liberate themselves from the oppressiveness of Victorian dress, designed to compel the female figure to the ideal of frailty and helplessness by means of suffocating, rib-cracking stays. It must surely rank among the most constrictive fashions of relatively recent times. And she continues saying that no suggestion was made that only by adopting the dress of some other culture these women could liberate themselves. And nor has it ever been argued, whether in Mary Wollstonecraft's day, when European women had more rights, or in our own day, and even by the most radical feminists, that because male domination and injustice to women have existed throughout the West's recorded history, that the only recourse for Western women is to abandon Western cultures and find themselves some other culture. The idea seems absurd, and yet this is routinely how the matter of improving the status of women is posed with respect to women in Arab and non-Western countries. That gives you an idea of how usually Western women are never called upon to abandon their culture despite the recognition of its sexist practices, yet because it's not culturalized in that way, in the way that we see it done when we speak about the situation of women in Muslim majority countries. And of course, the discourse here becomes a question of what is called culture talk versus rights talk. And as many recent feminist studies of human rights and culture talk and rights talk have shown, that one of the problems of the discourse of human rights is that, of course, the fact that it emerges and issues from a specific white middle-class Protestant American, sometimes European setting, is never seen as a cultural manifestation or reflection of those societies. Somehow, the discourse of human rights becomes universal. Right? Any response to it becomes particular, that critiques it becomes particular and cultural, but it itself, in fact, is always presented as something universal and must be adopted as such, and of course, through the ability of U.S. international power at the United Nations and elsewhere. Many of the definitions of these gender rights and different kinds of gender violence are culturalized or universalized accordingly. I would perhaps stop here since I'm out of time. Just to say that when the book has received upwards of 50 or 60 maybe reviews, there's been several journals that dedicated engagements and discussions with them, and I responded to several of the contributions. And one of the things that struck me in many of these reviews, positive reviews and engagements that seem to like the arguments that the book makes, is that despite recognizing the limitations of liberal thought in relation to the questions of democracy or liberal regimes in relation to the question of engagement with Islam, they insistingly feel that the only solution to these liberal problems can be found in liberalism. The attachment to liberalism is such that it's become, they have to always respond and show that their responses still keep us where we are to begin with, but I see the frustration. So it's a habit of mind, I think, but it's also a political commitment that they seem not to abandon, at least a good number of them. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.